So the following water report has data up to January 10th. As far as precipitation for the month of January, we have received about 1/2 inch as compared to the average of 6.44 inches. So in terms of percentage, that's about 8% of average for the month of January. And when we're looking at comparison of year to date, normal September through January is 19.02 inches, and we've received 5.55. Next slide. And for percentage as compared for this date, that's 37.9%. Now I want to take a second and go ahead and look at the scenarios of the 90% exceedance, which is your dry scenario, the 50% exceedance, which is your average scenario, and the 10% exceedance, which is your wet. And as you can see, we are starting to see shifts down where even in the wet scenario, we're starting to get closer to a historical average that we might receive within a precipitation year. And then the other thing I want to point out is currently, even in the dry scenario, from now until the end of January, there's about 2 inches that you would normally see. So I want you guys to keep that number in mind of that 2-inch number in a dry scenario. So next slide, please. So currently in the 8-day forecast for both the US model and European model, we are not seeing any kind of precipitation activity locally or within the watershed. Next slide. Now in the 16-day, we start to see a little bit more activity, but so in the US model, locally you see less than 1/4 inch, and then within the watershed, you're seeing less than 1 inch. And then with the European, even less. Really locally, there's no precipitation predicted. And then within the watershed, you're looking at less than 1/10 of an inch predicted. So I want to bring back that 2 inches that I mentioned earlier. So even in our dry scenario, we were expecting at least 2 more inches from now to the end of January. But based on these 16-day forecasts, we're looking at conditions that are even drier than our normal used dry scenario. So it's even drier than the 90% exceedance. Next slide, please. Now looking at our 16-day temperatures locally, and so just as some kind of marks to reference, the normal average maximum for this time of year starts around 54 degrees and then moves its way up to 57 degrees by the end of the 16-day period. So when we're looking at this, we're starting out almost 10 degrees above average, and then we start to slowly move towards that end of the 16-day to pretty close to average on the maximum temperatures. Now on the minimum temperatures, we kind of see a little bit different pattern. So normal minimums start around 40 degrees and then move up to about 41 degrees by the end of the 16-day period. So you'll notice that we're starting out almost 10 degrees below average as we're starting the 16-day period, and then move to about 5 degrees below average. So we're seeing a large range between our high and low temperatures. Next slide. For City and County of San Francisco storage, they currently have 409,903 acre feet, with Hetch Hetchy at 208,080 acre feet. Next slide. And as far as releases, they've been holding fairly steady at 461 CFS through the month of January, and diversions have been about 231 CFS. Next slide. Don Pedro Water Bank is at 542,329 acre feet, and the maximum is 570,000 acre feet. As of now, they have been holding Water Bank pretty steady. Next slide. And here we have Don Pedro Storage. So currently Don Pedro is at about 1.37 million acre feet, with the elevation at 771 feet. For this meeting, I have extended the Don Pedro storage forecast all the way to the end of the calendar year. And so in the dry scenario, we're looking at about 709.5 feet. in the average, you have 741.1 feet, and in the wet, 792.6 feet. I do want to note that both the average and dry scenarios do assume reductions in our irrigation. And then the other thing I want to note is, as earlier I mentioned, the precip that's forecasted in the next 16 days is lower than a 90% exceedance or our dry scenario, which means if those forecasts hold and there's not a shift to wetter conditions, then likely all of these scenarios will shift down slightly due to that lack of precip. Next slide. Now for Don Pedro releases, we have been releasing about 176 CFS to the river. Next slide. Now looking at computed natural flow, so the average CFS for the month of January has been about 74, which gives you an acre feet of 1,470 acre feet. Next slide. Now looking at these in comparison to the normal monthly, currently we're at less than 1% of the average January full natural flow. And if we continue to stay at that 74 CFS average through the rest of the month, then we're really expecting January to end up about 3% of average for full natural flow. And we can see the previous months have all been below average for full natural flow as well. Next slide. And for the accumulated full natural flow, we're at 21,923 acre feet. Next slide. All right, so this is a little bit of a new slide, so I want to take a second to walk through it. So essentially, the red line is showing what our current 2021 water year accumulation has been, so that 21,923 acre feet. And then you see these dotted lines moving out. So in the orange dashed line, you have our dry scenario or the 90% exceedance. The green dashed line is your 50% exceedance or average scenario, and the blue dashed line is your 10% exceedance or your wet scenario. And in order to give a little bit of reference on these scenarios or outlooks, I have placed a few years that are fairly similar to these. So we're looking at 1977, which is the driest year on record. Is still drier than our 90% exceedance. But like I said, the next 16 days are drier than what that is predicting. So we will see that shift down if this forecast holds. And the same thing holds true even in the average scenario where we're looking at it close to 2013, which was the second year of our 4-year drought. But once again, we're looking at drier conditions moving forward. That is expected to shift down 150,000 acre feet likely. And then in the wet scenario, it's pretty close. We're starting to get close to the DWR average, or what you would historically see on average. And once again, the wet will also shift down, and this one will shift about 300,000 acre feet. So when we consider those shifts down due to the next 16 days being drier than a 90% exceedance, you're looking at the dry end at a 23% of average water year. On the average end, you're looking at about a 47% of average water year. And then on the wet end, you'd be looking at closer to a 95% of average water year if that 16-day stays dry.
Olivia?
Yes.
Did you pick those comparisons basically from the accumulated rainfall from January past, January, February, or January, December, November?
So these are as far as the wet, average, and dry scenarios?
No. So did you pick those comparison years, 1977 and 2013? Did you pick them on them being the driest, or did you pick them that they started out as low precipitation at the beginning of the precipitation year?
So part of the reason is due to the fact that the overall accumulation of those years were fairly close to our current projections for those for the average projection and the dry projection. And the other reason is both those years were second years of a drought period. So 76 was a dry year, and then 77 was the subsequent dry year. 2012 was a dry year, so 2013 would have been the subsequent. And because last year was about a 54% of average year, so a kind of a first dry year, that was another reason we chose second dry years to compare them to.
Sure. Did you look at any past rainfall patterns that mimic this year?
So past rainfall patterns were, this year we have been looking at pretty historic dry conditions. So it's looking at about the second driest period from October to January as of now, and it likely will get drier with this forecast. And so, you know, as you can tell, in 2013, it was a little bit wetter starting out in December. So we had a wetter December in 2013, which kind of helped conditions in a way because the watershed was a little bit more prime. That soil moisture was brought up slightly. So that's why I mentioned that even these outlooks that I have, the wet, average, and dry, are a little bit high in my opinion, because it has been so dry and is expected to stay dry.
So we never had a really wet February or wet March or April.
I mean, you always have the possibility of it, you know, a miracle March or an awesome April. But even with extreme wet conditions or fairly wet conditions, we're really only expecting to get close to average or just slightly below average.
Okay.
I mean, there's always a possibility you could have extreme wet conditions even above what is predicted here, but then you also have the same thing on the dry end. It could be drier than what our dry condition is.
Okay.
Good morning, Olivia. Last week we had both the European and the American model both agreeing on a lot of rain coming our way and snow. What happened to that forecast?
So for some reason this year forecasts have been a lot more volatile. It's kind of the volatility you would normally see in fall. And now we're seeing it within the winter period. There's a lot of different activity going around in the atmosphere that's causing changes. So there has been not to get too deep into it, but there's things like the polar vortex has been splitting. There has been changes in, just the full atmospheric patterns. So based on that, then a lot of these models are changing quickly in order to adapt to those larger atmospheric changes.
Good.
Any other questions?
Questions for Olivia? Are you done, Olivia?
No, I still have more, but I just didn't want to skip past this if there was more questions regarding this.
I have a question, Olivia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. With the temperatures approaching 70 degrees next week, I think we're going to get a lot of calls for water or questions about it anyway. So I hope we have a message and we're prepared for as to what, or I'd like to kind of alert the general manager and the board that we might have to make those decisions here sooner rather than
yes.
later.
We've been having some discussions regarding this. We've been keeping track of what the local precipitation has been, as well as cloud cover and also temperature conditions locally, as well as keeping track of what kind of calls might be coming into Mike. But I think Mike might be able to speak a little bit more to that as well.
Good morning, gentlemen. So over the past few days, we've received half a dozen different requests for orders. Most of them are for forage crops. A lot of them, again, are people utilizing their nutrient water on their ground also. So overall, we have not really received too many phone calls from people asking about water, what the water is like. We've made some few phone calls, but everybody that we've talked to is still in pretty decent shape. These cool temperatures, and Director Macedo, you made the comment that's going to be up close to 70. I think these cool temperatures right now have helped us because it's been wet, it's been foggy. So the dew has helped us tremendously. Right now, again, we still have not received any or a multitude of phone calls to even, suggest that we would do anything different. But just so the board knows, we are making the canals available for customers. Whenever they do contact us, we're doing what we can to line up pumps for them and take care of those situations.
Thanks, Mike.
All right.
One more question for Olivia on this graph. So we see 13 and we see 77, looks like it's following pretty close. Is there any water year that follows that to where we are currently on that red line to that wet scenario? Is there any years that you know of that follow that one?
So in order to get a year that is going to follow exactly is very difficult. But I mean, as you could tell, there are years that it will turn wet, and that's what's causing this. Is we've had years where the meteorological conditions and temperatures would allow for us to reach full natural flows of that level. So I mean, you'd be looking at years kind of like a 2016. You might have conditions similar to that. But exact years that I would pull out, I could definitely do the next time versus comparing it just to the DWR average.
Yeah, well, I just see 77 staring me in the face there. It looks like it's following pretty close. I just want something on the other side of that to make me feel better, I guess.
Well, no, that was what my questions were kind of directed towards too. Thanks, Olivia.
Yeah, it's definitely very difficult to find years that specifically match all the way through, even from the beginning all the way to the end of the scenario predictions. You can get close, but definitely not easy, because even you can see in 2013 from starting mid-November, it doesn't match up until you hit about that June-July mark on our forecast. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. Next slide. And looking at the computed natural flow to date for October through January, normal is about 308,000 acre feet. And so right now we're running about 7.1% for the date. Next slide. Turlock Lake Storage is at 8,097 acre feet. Next slide. And here is the weekly watershed status report. So for Don Pedro elevation, it has not changed since last week. We've been holding fairly steady. And then in comparison to where we were last year, it's about 25 feet lower than where we were last year.